in response to police killings exploded into demonstrations, uprisings, riots. The governor sent the National Guard, the president sent in investigators from the Justice Department and the FBI, and a fairly new organization called Black Lives Matter put out a call for activists to come to Ferguson over Labor Day for training and action. The response was so overwhelming that they later limited their invitation to young people of color, but I already had my ticket. And I did try to find someone to go in my place, but I think because the students weren't back yet, my contacts, all of whom were on the campus in terms of young activists, they didn't answer my emails or my phone calls. So I got on a plane and I went. And I went in part because I had a local guide, my friend and colleague, Susan McGinn, and she had a connection to the local UU church there. And their ministers, the UU ministers, were just exhausted. And so they welcomed a chance to have a couple of us come in and represent Unitarian Universalism and our faith community at the meetings and the marches that were happening over the course of that weekend so that they could get some rest. Susan picked me up at the airport. We grabbed a quick sandwich and literally headed straight to an interfaith forum and prayer service at St. Paul's AME Church. And there I learned that in Ferguson, a town of 23,000, the police issued over 32,000 citations, traffic citations in 2012, most of them for things like speeding or expired tags. I also learned that the fines from those citations were the number 2 source of income for the township, and that low-income people who had trouble paying the fines or getting to their court dates were regularly jailed, including parents of young children. Of course, being jailed meant they could not earn money, they could not go to work, which meant they couldn't pay the fines, and that this was a weight that the community had been living under for decades. I don't even have words. I didn't then, I don't now. So the next day, we went to the big march, which was sponsored by Black Lives Matter, as well as the NAACP and the Muslim Brotherhood and other local organizations. There were thousands and thousands of people there, mostly people of color, a lot of families with kids. I walked next to a woman who was a sociology professor and her 2 boys who were 7 and 11. She was nervous, but said that she felt like she had to march because her boys are growing up and things needed to change so that they would feel safe in the world. Her story was way more typical of the people there than the stories that the media chose to lift up about people wearing masks and throwing bottles and tipping police cars and lighting fires. The march went down the street to Canfield Apartments where Mike Brown had lived. There was a team of Little League baseball players standing there in their uniforms. I'm a boy mom, so when I see little boys, it just gets me, right? So we stood around the spot where Michael was shot. There were speeches and prayers. The people extended as far as the eye could see. And the organizers of the march had planned then to head to a park for more speeches, but a whole clump of younger activists wanted to go to the police station. And so that chunk of protesters peeled off and walked another 2 miles to get there. By the time I arrived at the police station, there were several hundred people congregated on one side of a line marked by crime scene tape. And on the other side was the line of police officers, all standing blank-faced with their hands behind their backs and their guns on their belts. And they were trying not to react as the protesters, less than 2 feet away, literally screamed in their face with their pain and their rage. It was really hard to watch, really hard to witness. When a second set of officers with zip ties on their belts came to join their colleagues, protesters knew that that was a sign. The zip ties come out and then the tanks come, and so most of them started to peel away and head home. At this point, it became clear that the best way for me to be of use, for us to be of use, was to give people rides back to the starting point of the march. My favorite passenger was also, ironically, a young man named Michael. He was also a big guy, probably about 6'5". He told me he worked as a security guard during the week. And he carried a sign, and on one side was a list of names: Eric Garner, Amadou Diallo, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, and so on, all the way down. All black men, all gunned down. On the other side, he had the Jon Stewart quote, "You think you're tired of hearing about racism, imagine living with it." And I'd watched, and what he did with that sign, with his large, solid presence, was he would go and he would stand next to the angriest of the protesters, the ones who were screaming, and he would just stand there silently, holding his sign. When he got in the car, I said, "I noticed what you did there. I think it was really powerful and effective." And he just said, "I didn't need to say anything. I figured the sign said it all." So last month, the New York Times published, as I mentioned, this entire series of articles on the 5th anniversary of Ferguson. And I subscribed to the New York Times specifically so that I would be able to read all of these articles online. I've been subscribing to the Washington Post. Anyway, so I've subscribed to the Times so I could read them. And there are a whole bunch of them. In addition to the article that I quoted from as our reading, there's one detailing what's happened to the activists since the protests. Most of them are still actively fighting to dismantle racism in one way or another, but they also, all of them, to a person, they spoke about the trauma that they experienced and the fact that they are in counseling, that they're having to work to heal. And then there are the 6 prominent activists who've been found dead. Some of apparent suicides or drug overdoses, and there are suspicious circumstances surrounding a number of those deaths. It's not easy to read. Another article describes the children growing up in Ferguson. These protests have been a part of their formative identity. In the words of the Times reporters, a generation of largely African-American children in Ferguson has been molded by the unrest of 2014 and a messy epilogue of halting progress and still raw racial divides. They continue, Ferguson has become their shared birthmark, a source of pride and stigma. Other articles look at the changes in the state of policing and the local government. There are a lot more black police officers, a lot more body cameras, but it hasn't made much of a difference in the rate of police violence. A law was actually passed to limit the percentage of a municipality's budget that comes from traffic citations, and it helped a little. But the statistics for traffic stops still show that they're overwhelmingly more common in communities of color. So what the articles as a whole showed is that there's been progress, but it's been of sort of the 1 step forward, 2 steps back variety. I believe and I felt and what I experienced was that something good and liberating was set in motion 5 years ago, and it gathered steam. As a society, I feel like we are learning, we're waking up. But there's also a huge, powerful backlash. The rising tide of white nationalist extremism, boys with tiki torches in Charleston, racially motivated mass shootings, the racist rhetoric being spewed at the highest level of our government, not to mention the racist policies being implemented. Racism is our nation's deepest, oldest wound. It's been festering for hundreds of years, and every attempt to lance that infection so that it can heal seems to result in an explosive backlash of hate. It's very disheartening and hard. But at least in our Unitarian Universalist universe, with our first principle putting us so clearly on the side of human rights and dignity, things are going great, right? Well, those of you who follow denominational politics know that in 2017, there was a controversial hiring decision that led to accusations of white supremacy in the institution, several high-profile resignations. In the chaos that followed, multiple efforts to move us forward in this work of dismantling racism were initiated. A commission on institutional change was formed, and they've been working diligently to assess the health of our denomination with regards to race and racism. The UUA board voted to fund Blue, Black Lives UU, to the tune of $5 million. We held white supremacy teach-ins, Promise and Practice Sundays. And as a faith community, we've been deliberately trying to center the voices of people of colors and others who hold marginalized identities. We've been having tough conversations about what constitutes harm, how to hold one another accountable. We're doing the work. We're doing it imperfectly, but we're doing this faithfully as we can. Sadly, though, I have to tell you that even in Unitarian Universalism, there's been a backlash, and it's hitting very close to home. My friend Todd Eckloff, the minister of the Spokane Church, who preached from this pulpit, who I trusted enough to let into this pulpit just last year, wrote a book that's become a rallying point for people who feel displaced or shamed or uncomfortable with the work that the denomination is doing around race and racism. In my opinion, it's not a very good book. You're welcome to your opinion, but I can't recommend it. And what it's done is it's crystallized for me the issue at the heart of the UU-specific backlash. It comes down to 2 letters. Todd and his fans believe that a rational approach should be enough to create the beloved community. That is to say, we ought to be able to think our way to a just world. Sadly, as the authors of the favorite book I read on my sabbatical, mistakes were made, but not by me. In that book, they demonstrate quite clearly none of us are nearly as rational as we'd like to think we are. Every last one of us is subject to confirmation bias. Meanwhile, the current national UU leadership is taking not a rational approach, but a relational approach. 2 letters. They believe that ours is a covenantal faith, and as such, we're connected by our promise to remain in loving, respectful relationship. In the context of relationship, we choose our words and change our behaviors in response when people we care about tell us that the impact of the things we're saying or doing is painful to them. Avoiding ableist language isn't political correctness, it's not censorship, it's not thought policing. It's an act of love we choose out of respect and caring for the person who's brave enough to say to us, you know, those words exclude me and that hurts. If we accept the notion that we are held gently but firmly in a web of mutually respectful and mutually accountable relationships, then we navigate our conflicts and misunderstandings in ways that lead to growth and deepening. Unfortunately, some people experience being held accountable as a threat. They feel called out when someone tells them they've made a mistake, rather than feeling called in to repair the relationship. They experience the setting of boundaries as rejection or even attack, hence the backlash. I understand the backlash because I feel some of these things inside me too. I feel the flood of defensiveness, the desire to assert that I am a good person, the temptation to slide into logical arguments about grammar, to critique techniques or tone. One of the things that makes this work so hard is that I think all of us, to some extent, and some of us to great extent, have internalized a sense that to be worthy, we have to be above reproach. Being held accountable for our mistakes triggers feelings of shame, and shame is a tough emotion to feel. It's a tough emotion to work with. Reverend Teresa, your sabbatical minister, once offered what I think is one of the most brilliant mini-sermons I've ever seen. She wrote, "People are mistakey, but good." One of the things that I've been working on is unhooking my own shame response, which doesn't mean I don't have it. I do. It's hard and it's painful, but I figure it's my responsibility to work with it. to soften it, to transform it, not the work of people who may have unwittingly harmed in my mistakiness. Being mistakey, being imperfect, messing up and having blind spots, acting without thinking, causing harm, that's all part of being human and being in community. It doesn't mean I'm bad, doesn't mean I'm unworthy of love. And when I ground myself in that knowing that I'm worthy and lovable, then I can find my way to a more gracious response when I'm called in, when my mistakiness is called to my attention. Dismantling white supremacy in our world and in our faith and in ourselves is heart work, not head work. We need to, or not just head work, we need to metabolize the grief, the guilt, and the trauma so that our nation's ugly history doesn't keep us from doing what is right in the present for the sake of the future. We need to grieve whatever it is we are losing or whatever it is we think we are losing as we do this work. Perhaps our illusion that we're exceptional, perhaps actual power and influence. We need to unhook that shame response and find our way to something more helpful. It's not easy. But if you're tired of talking and thinking and feeling about racism, imagine living with it. We're launching a racial justice book discussion group here at church. Through the lens of narrative and poetry, we'll sit together in these kinds of questions, in the difficulty of these issues. Compassionately, patiently, we'll do the heart work. We'll allow ourselves to be transformed by our relationships to the text and with each other. We'll meet on the second and fourth Wednesdays of each month from 6 to 7:30. We've been invited to join the family support groups, the family support group for dinner before our meetings at 5:30. Find Nancy Nelson during coffee hour. She has the first book, which is Brown Girl Dreaming. If you'd like to take part, second and fourth Wednesdays. With regards to the backlash out there in the wider world, we know what we need to do, more or less. We need to vote our consciences. We need to support local initiatives that advance human rights, combat bullying, combat racial profiling. We need to act in solidarity with people who are victims of racism and hate. We need to show up for everyone who's being targeted, and if need be, put our bodies between them and those who would cause them harm. With regards to the backlash in the UU universe, I feel like I want to get between the backlash and this congregation, but maybe that's a little paternalistic. I guess I just don't think it's worth a lot of our energy or our time. There are too many real issues to work on. The backlash is a fake fight. We know who we are. We know whose we are. We know what our values are. Thoughts and prayers are not going to solve the gun violence epidemic, and thoughts and prayers aren't going to build the beloved community either. Relationships are. As for me, I support the work that the current leaders of our faith are doing, to the extent that, God help me, I agreed to serve a second term on the UU Ministers Association board in order to move forward a small piece of this work. With regards to the backlash in our hearts, I think the most important thing we can do is to remain open. Let ourselves feel the heartbreak, the shame, untangle it, unhook it. We can teach ourselves that being mistakey doesn't mean we're not good. We can choose to treat everyone as if they are beloved and holy, starting with ourselves. We can trust that web of relationships and allow it to hold us even as it transforms us and calls us onward. So be it, and so may it be.